Hi, this is Andrew Marty from SACS. The subject matter today is the stress of COVID-19 and how to manage it. The reason we put this presentation together is that after some 6 months or so facing the COVID-19 challenge here in Australia, many people have started to report that employees are becoming more stressed, more anxious, or generally less secure in their work and in their home lives. And so we put this presentation together, which draws heavily from the world of organisational psychology and also from the world of clinical psychology, to give some guidance about how leaders might tackle the challenge of keeping levels of wellbeing high in themselves and in employees during the COVID-19 challenge. First, just some brief information about SACS. SACS is an organisational psychology business. We're involved in psychological testing, wellbeing surveys, 360-degree feedback. We're also involved in individual and organisational development, including change management, coaching, career transition management, and a very big activity area for us is workforce planning. We also help organisations to design recruitment processes, and we actually deliver recruitment processes for organisations. In terms of how we do our work, we are involved in a thing called the scientist practitioner model, which means that we are primary researchers, mainly in partnership with Deakin University, and we've had many publications as part of that research partnership, but also that allows us to take primary research and turn it into products for our clients. So we take an evidence-based approach to people management, and that's the perspective that we're taking in this presentation. So just to set some objectives for the presentation, we're going to talk about stressors, things that cause stress. So COVID-19 is an obvious stressor at the moment across the world. We're going to talk about work-related stress versus stress in people's private lives. We're going to talk about stress and what it does to us, how it changes our brain and the effect that it has on us. We're going to talk about acute versus chronic stress. And I guess one of the things that's really interesting is that the COVID-19 challenge has now reached to a length where it can be considered to be something that could contribute to chronic stress or cause chronic stress. We're going to ask the fascinating question of whether we are equally, open quotes, stressable, close quotes, which is to say, are some people more stress sensitive than others? And we're going to talk about what turns stress into trauma. We're going to give you some indication about the warning signs that people can see in themselves and in their staff to understand when it is time to make a move on this kind of thing. We're going to talk about self-management, and finally we're going to finish with some strong leadership tips about how to act in the world of COVID-19 to maintain and to ensure that levels of well-being are as high as they possibly can in ourselves and in our colleagues. So firstly, to talk about stressors, here's 41 major life stressors, very old study here, and the reason that we include this is that there really haven't been too many studies where people have addressed these findings and found anything different from Holmes and Rahe going back to 1967, which is interesting because it says that the key stressors in our lives haven't changed that much in terms of their importance in the last several decades. But what you'll see here is that my colleague Georgia has indicated some stressors which would seem to be particularly well related to COVID-19. So personal injury or illness, or the fear of that, that's a big stressor for people, and COVID-19 is exactly what we're talking about. We have seen much downsizing of industry sectors, so dismissal from work is an important stressor. Change in health of a family member, similar to our own health, these things are both very important to us. Business readjustment, I mean, that's basically the whole world, isn't it? Even if your business is prospering, I'll bet that a greater proportion of employees are working from home. Changing your financial state, many people have experienced that. Change in frequency of arguments, we put a question mark there, but we do know that under stress people do sometimes argue more. And of course the 41 is change in responsibilities at work, and for many people that's very true. So we shouldn't be surprised if people are stressed about COVID-19 because it's ticking a lot of boxes in the major life stressors list. Then there are work stressors, and work stressors come in two forms. We're going to call the first type good stressors, which are things like the pressure of workload. In other words, as people's workload increase, that does not necessarily mean that their well-being declines. And that's the definition of good stressors. Good stressors are stressors that typically improve our well-being, improve what we're going to call engagement with work, engagement being a positive psychological state that reflects on a person's attitudes to their work. If they bring a lot of positive energy to their work, then they can be considered to be engaged. Pressure of workload, when it increases, typically increases levels of engagement until it gets to the point where it can't be borne anymore, and of course then it will become a negative stressor. Pressure of processing lots of information, that's a positive stressor. In other words, if we are involved in processing information, our brain likes to do that kind of thing, simplify things and make meaning of things. And pressure of problem solving. In other words, I guess the second and third of these are really, if we're doing interesting, challenging work, then that's good for us. If we're doing boring and repetitive work, then that's bad for us. So those are the positive stressors. And then we'll talk about the negative stressors, which are in the research literature called hindrance demands, lack of social support. Well, that is a work stressor for a lot of people right now, because many people who are used to working in offices have, over the last 6 to 8 months, had to get used to working remotely. And I guess one of the things that we would say is it's distinctly possible that many people will never go back to the kind of classic office setup. Many organisations have taken the view that it's working pretty well to work remotely. They have to pay less for rent, and many organisations are suffering commercially, and so they want to minimise their expenses, and so why would you have offices if working remotely works well? So that may well be part of the new normal, and certainly I think we can state with some confidence that the proportion of staff that works from home will be higher than previous to COVID-19, and perhaps forever. Inadequate resources and job security. Well, job insecurity is, of course, a key stressor. The fear that I'm going to lose my job, and many people have. Inadequate resources. So we send people off to work remotely. Do they have the equipment that's necessary to do that effectively? Role ambiguity. So the job that we were doing before COVID-19, are we still pursuing the same outcomes in that job, or have the outcomes that we're pursuing changed? And the answer is that some organisations are pretty much doing what they did previously. Others are actually offering a different service or different outcomes, and that has made a difference to people's clarity about their roles. Sometimes the jobs have morphed, but the official statements relating to job clarity have not morphed so effectively. Role conflict, where contrary requirements come from different people around us. And certainly many of the people that we speak to at SACS are saying that roles have changed markedly, and sometimes people are being pulled in multiple directions. Mary Smith wants me to do this, Bill Bloggs wants me to do that. So those are two types of work stressors. I want to say a little bit about the relationship between work and life stressors. So life stressors are different from work stressors, and you can be comfortable at work and highly engaged when you've got a lot of problems in your private life. Obviously and conversely, you can have a situation where your private life is fantastic, but your work life is terrible. If you are at work, what affects you most severely is the work situation. Yes, your home situation can intrude, but it actually takes a pretty severe home situation to intrude on a person's work life. A person who has a great job will often go to that great job, sometimes to avoid a bad situation at home. And so that's not an uncommon thing. So I think that what we have to do, I want to give a tip straight up to any leader. It may well be that you can sympathise, empathise, care about a person's home situation, but you may not be able to do that much about it. So I recommend that what you should do is focus on the work situation. Yes, if there's indications that there are home concerns, call for EAP, encourage people to take up the resources that you have to deal with their private situation. But as a leader in the workplace, your primary responsibility is to create a workplace which has high levels of well-being. And that's what I would encourage you to focus on. Now, how does the brain respond to stress? Well, it responds with a very archaic kind of response. The flight mode, and flight mode is where the body equips itself to run away from some kind of a threat. The fight mode, where the body equips itself to physically attack whatever is threatening it. And then there's the freeze mode where fight and flight is just not going to work. And the freeze mode is where the person withdraws into him or herself and becomes kind of hunkers down, almost like an animal that can't fight or can't run away. So it tries to hide in amongst the grass. Now, all of this evolved, of course, way back, tens, hundreds of thousands of years ago. And so these are very ancient solutions, and they're suited to a world where the threats were rather short term. So for instance, if you're a hunter-gatherer and you're about to be attacked by a saber-toothed tiger, that issue is resolved pretty quickly. You either get eaten or you win the fight, or perhaps you jump somewhere and escape, maybe jump to a river or climb a tree or something like that. So those sorts of threats are sort of threats that might last, an hour max? So we have this equipment in our brain for dealing with very short-term threats, but our threats are no longer short-term, are they? They are threats that can go on for months, and COVID-19 is part of that. So you'll see from the list of how the hypothalamus affects our body, you'll see that these things are incredibly primal in many ways. Our heart beats faster. Why? Because a fast beating heart is good for fighting or running away. Our pupils dilate. Why do our pupils dilate? Well, simple. Because if you've got dilated pupils, it means that your peripheral vision is better, particularly in low light. And in the hunter-gatherer era, we were mainly attacked at dusk. We're heading back to our cave, and what happens, a saber-toothed tiger appears or something. So the biggest risks were in that period between night and day. And so the dilated pupils are to see better peripherally when light is low. Rapid breathing. So, we breathe more rapidly. Our senses become sharper. Well, we need that for fight or flight. We get a rush of adrenaline. Adrenaline makes us temporarily stronger. By the way, if we keep getting rushes of adrenaline, then that often gets associated with other negative chemicals like cortisol, and we can end up with inflammation responses. So, being stressed for a long time is really bad for us. Some other things that happen is that the capillaries on the outside of our body tend to contract, and that's why we can look really pale when we're in fight and flight mode. Because if you've contracted your capillaries, it's harder for you to bleed to death because you've actually shut down the main area where you tend to bleed. And not only that, but you pump all of your blood into your vital organs, which will help you to either fight or flee. But as well as that, our immune system tends to be suppressed. And so this is because of short-termism. The immune system is expensive to run, and why would we run our immune system if we're about to be attacked by a saber-toothed tiger? I mean, who cares about getting the flu when you're just about to be eaten by a saber-toothed tiger? In fact, who cares about getting cholera when you're about to be attacked by a saber-toothed tiger? So, all short-termism. The problem with all of this is that if your immune system is suppressed for a long period, of course, you then start to get some of the collateral damage that we get from these kinds of challenges, like you get sick. And as I like to tell people when I lectured at university, at exam time we would find that the clinic would be full of people who had genuine illnesses, not imaginary illnesses, genuine illnesses. Tonsil infections, infections of the urinary tract, whatever. People would tend to get sick more often. Why? Because they were in fight and flight and freeze mode for a long period of time. So the freeze response is kind of fight and flight on hold. And when we're under stress, our brains are less productive and we don't think so creatively and so effectively. So this really raises the question of whether we are equally stressable. And this diagram here is describing a thing called the window of tolerance. So the window of tolerance is when the body is in its optimum state. In other words, we're mentally alert and we can be in touch with both our emotions and also we can work cognitively, which means we can think things through. So the fight, flight and freeze response works as follows. When we leave our window of tolerance, we can become hyper-aroused, and hyper-arousal is all about the fight and flight response. If you see traumatized children, you will often find that they get in this situation where they're just constantly scanning the world for threats and they can't settle down, they can't relax, and they tend to overreact to things, and not only that, they just don't think things through clearly. The alternative is hypoarousal, where we are becoming withdrawn into ourselves. We can become depressed, lethargic, numb, unmotivated. And of course, that's a very negative situation as well. So the window of tolerance is where we can cope with stress. When bad stuff comes up, then we can cope and we don't go hypoarousal or hyperarousal. The interesting thing about the window of tolerance is, of course, it varies quite markedly from person to person. And that's a combination of nature and nurture, which I'll explain in just a moment. But one of the things that we also know is that ongoing long-term stress can shrink your window of tolerance. If you've been in a stress situation for a long time, you can become more stress sensitive and your window of tolerance becomes smaller. The very famous book called The Body Keeps the Score describes how neurologically and physically we change because of the experience of trauma. And one of the things that does happen is that our window of tolerance literally shrinks and we can cope with less. Now, we know there's a bunch of techniques associated with mindfulness and positive psychology activity that can help to extend one's window of tolerance, and we'll mention those a little bit later on in this presentation. So your window of tolerance is affected by some things which are largely genetically determined. Your cognitive ability, how smart you are, can affect how tolerant you are to new things. We know that on balance, people who are smarter learn more quickly and can cope in a general sense with more challenges. They can also get through stuff more quickly and they can make less mistakes. This is partially determined by personality as well, of course, but in a general sense, smart people have an advantage when it comes to coping. Personality has a massive impact on your window of tolerance. In other words, people who are emotionally stable tend to be much more tolerant than people who are emotionally unstable, but we'll get into that in a bit more detail in just a second. And then, of course, nurture. You can learn skills to make yourself better able to cope. So resilience training is a thing. Learned optimism is a thing. And you can learn some skills to help you to do that. You can also build some experiences. So if you've tried something and it's worked, then of course this is a resource for you. And when I ran the live version of this presentation, it was amazing the number of people who had used apps like Headspace or Calm, just phone apps which are mindfulness based, and they said that they'd really made a positive difference. Well, clearly those apps will have taught people some skills, but it also will have provided them with some experience to say, hey, okay, mindfulness is a resource I can draw on to help me in this situation. And then your style, your attitudes and values are all acquired in the course of life, but they can have an effect on stress because, for instance, your attitudes to particular challenges can lead you to focus on different things. And we're going in a few moments to talk to you about focus and how that affects people's levels of well-being. Focusing on the right things markedly improves your levels of well-being. Focusing on things which are not helpful to you tends to damage your levels of well-being. So I touched on personality very briefly, and I'm going to touch on it a little bit less briefly now, but this is personality as it relates to the window of tolerance and to resilience generally. So the first thing I want to talk about is emotionality. People are variable in respect of the degree to which they are emotionally stable or emotionally unstable. Now, if you are unlucky enough to be born highly emotional, then you may well end up being an artist or something like that, because we certainly know that many creative people draw on their very strong emotions to create wonderful works of art. But if you're a run-of-the-mill citizen, one of the things that we also know is that people who are highly emotional, and remember this is a very heavily genetically determined characteristic, we really should have compassion for people who are highly emotional, because they quite often end up in hospital more often, they end up with psychological illness more often. I mean, clearly, if anxiety and threat sensitivity and being overly empathic, if they become strong enough, that is a clinical issue. So this is part of a thing called resilience. When people are low in emotionality, which means emotionally stable, they tend to be more resilient. Another driver of people's tolerance in respect of challenging and stressful circumstances is their level of conscientiousness. Once more, if you're lucky enough to be a highly conscientious person, what that means is that you have a genetically developed capacity to focus on things for a long period of time, to be organised, to be structured in the way that you make decisions. And all of that is really, really helpful to your capacity to deal with challenging circumstances. And that is the second personality component of resilience. So a person who is low in emotionality and high in conscientiousness has a personality which is inclined to be resilient. Another component of resilience is this here, cheerfulness and optimism. So people who cope with stress in general have a natural tendency to positivity, a natural tendency to having positive emotions in their life. So once more, if you have the capacity to have this cheerfulness, optimism characteristic in your personality, you are much more likely to be resilient than if you are gloomy and pessimistic. We see absence of anger. This is a personality characteristic. If people are low in absence of anger, what that means is that they are angry people. They have a characteristic that psychologists often call trait anger. And trait anger is, obviously our anger goes up and down in the course of days and weeks, but trait anger is that when our anger goes up and down, it rotates around a set point, which is high. If we have trait anger, we are dispositionally angry people. So when we're calm and not angry, well, we're probably a little bit angrier than average. When we're angry above our own average, well, we're really angry by comparison with the world. And we know that there are genetic carriers of this. There's a thing called the warrior gene, monoamine oxidase A, which is a driver of anger. And if you happen to be unfortunate enough to have this gene, then there's a fair chance that you're likely to visit jail at some stage, because people who have the warrior gene undertake crimes of anger far more often than people who don't. Extroversion. Extroversion generally, I mentioned cheerfulness and optimism, but extroverts tend to cope better with stress, largely because they seek and gain social contact. And we do know that that's a good stress management technique. Doesn't mean that introverts can't cope with stress, but it would be fair to say that introverts are slightly less effective in coping with stress because they simply don't draw on the social resources of other people so much. And then you have this characteristic called openness to experience. Openness to experience is the degree to which somebody is inclined to welcome new things. And not surprisingly, people who are high in this, they tend to be more likely to cope with stressful situations because they're simply more broad-minded about what is an acceptable outcome or an acceptable situation to work through. So that's a determinant of whether a person's likely to be stress sensitive. So if you want the perfect stress management personality, it might be somebody who's low in emotionality, who is low in anger, who's highly conscientious, who's cheerful and optimistic. Let's throw in a dash of broad-mindedness so that they can cope with whatever life tosses up to them without thinking that it's weird or strange. And this really is about being honest. I mean, honest people can be stress sensitive and dishonest people can be stress sensitive. So whilst this is a very important characteristic for things like change management and for trustworthiness, it's not as important in respect of the tolerance of stress as these other five are. So a person's tolerance is, as I mentioned earlier, very heavily determined by their natural propensity for positive emotions. That's the set point that I was talking to you about. That goes up and down. Our levels of happiness go up and down around this set point. But that baseline might well be 2/3 genetic, and I think it is 2/3 genetic. Like most of this stuff, you'll get arguments about whether it's 50% or 70%, but most people believe, most scientists believe that it's predominantly genetic. Cognitive ability. So how smart you are, I touched on this very briefly. People with higher cognitive ability have a natural capacity to learn and adapt, and cognitive ability at work is typically measured in terms of your capacity for words, numbers, or solving abstract problems. And in general, being smarter helps. But if you are emotionally unstable, being smart can kind of give you a genius for fretting, where you worry enormously about an extremely wide range of things that could go wrong. This is to do with values. This is the SACS work value scale. And the only thing I want to say about that is that if your values match the values of the workplace that you belong to, then you are much more likely to be able to cope with stress. I think one of the challenges that people face in times like now is that many employees believe that the organisation is departing from its traditionally held values, from the things that have traditionally been held to be precious to it. And if that's the case, then that makes employees very nervous and uncomfortable. So that can make people more stressable. Now, you can assess people's resilience on the way in. So I mentioned a bunch of personality characteristics, and we test this for many organisations. But it may not be a bad idea if you're recruiting at the moment to recruit people who are highly resilient, and that certainly can be done. You can see this individual here is a highly resilient person, and what that means is that their resilience risk is low. So people who are like that tend to have these positive characteristics. Now, stress can be acute, which means short-term and severe, or chronic. And there is research evidence that for some people, stress can become chronic after only 6 months. So I think we have to accept that if people are sensitive and receptive to stress, it may well be that people are slipping into chronic stress right now. So let's talk about how chronic stress affects the brain. First thing we want to say is that there is extremely strong research evidence that chronic stress can kill brain cells, literally diminish the number of functioning brain cells which people have. It also can change your brain's structure. And this is kind of fascinating. Your brain is made up largely of a mix of what's called grey matter and white matter. The grey matter is the thinking bit. That's what you use. That's the neurons that you use to be able to make decisions. The white matter is kind of like connective tissues, and so myelin producing cells. And what it means is that you end up with a change in the balance between grey and white matter. And when that happens, you end up with an excess of white matter. And what that means is that we make worse decisions. So we often say to people that if you're highly stressed, try not to make decisions that are going to be really important for the rest of your life. So chronic stress can rewire the brain, and that can cause us to make bad decisions. Also, there's evidence that prospective stress can change the process of memory. Have you ever noticed that when you're stressed, you might forget things more? Well, that's absolutely the case. Stress suppresses memory, particularly words and spatial relations. Words being, I suppose a good example. Have you ever had a conversation with somebody when you're stressed and you speak to them about it later and they remember a particular conversation, you remember another conversation, yet you both were having exactly the same conversation? And the reason is that we can forget words and their meaning during periods of stress. We can also forget spatial relations, and what that means, spatial relations, is your capacity to kind of envisage the way things fit together visually and spatially, and that's why we sometimes get lost more when we're stressed. When you're trying to work your way through a new city, even if you're using Google Maps or something like that, you have to use spatial relations to do this, and that's why we sometimes get lost more. You can also end up with mood disorders such as depression, other mental illnesses, and effects on the gastrointestinal system. We know that when people are chronically stressed, they often have very significant digestive problems. In fact, I read an article, I think it was in The Lancet, the UK academic journal for medicine, and it was saying that many of the people who consider themselves to have food allergies and perhaps gluten intolerance, some of them are just plain stressed. And the issue is not to do with gluten as much as it is with the stress experience that they're going through in their lives. By the way, of course, there are people who are gluten intolerant as well, but what this Lancet article said is that some people simply are stressed rather than having those kinds of food allergies. Now, how does stress turn into trauma? Well, how long you need to be immersed in trauma varies from person to person as to how long it's going to take this chronic effect to take place. So if you're a highly sensitive person, maybe a couple of months might be enough. If you're very resilient, it could be years. But one of the things that we know is that your nervous system can become stuck and intense systems tend to linger. And so you may start to feel worse where symptoms start to interfere with daily life, and then you're in a situation of post-traumatic stress. And so if you're experiencing any of these things, such as nightmares, if you find that you're avoiding certain situations, let me tell you, from a cognitive behavioral therapy point of view, avoidance is a bad thing to do. avoiding situations sends your brain a message that those situations are dangerous. And if you're phobic or even anxious about certain things, that's almost guaranteed to make you more phobic and more anxious. I mean, it feels good at the time because you're avoiding something, and you could even get a little rush of endorphins from that. But beware, because what you're doing is that you're sending the less conscious parts of your brain a message that these things are actually dangerous, and that can increase the degree to which phobic reactions and anxiety reactions can happen. Another sign is negative changes in emotions and beliefs. In other words, we start doubting what we used to care most deeply about. We start becoming very unconcerned about perhaps the well-being of others, those kinds of things. Things that used to be precious to us can be dumped if we are suffering from PTSD. And also hyperarousal, we're having difficulty sleeping or concentrating. They're all signs of PTSD. So if you're experiencing any of those, I would encourage you to seek out EAP or support from organisations like Beyond Blue. So this all sounds rather gloomy, doesn't it? And it leads us to raise the question, is this all bad? Is it all bad news about this COVID-19 stress stuff? Well, no, it's not, because it turns out that if people go through tough times, it might be said that, let's say, 60 to 70% of them will end up with around about the same levels of well-being as they were before they went into the tough times, or worse. That's if it's a significant traumatic event, let's say a natural disaster or something like that. But even people who go through natural disasters, it appears that somewhere between 20 and 40% of them actually get better from the experience. What do I mean by better? Well, they report themselves being happier, they report themselves being less anxious, they report themselves being less depressed. And so this is post-traumatic growth. And so that's when people change positively in the wake of struggling with a really highly challenging life circumstance. And the SARS epidemic, which is probably not a bad parallel for the COVID-19 epidemic, although in many parts of the world it didn't last so long and it didn't shut so many things down. But one of the things that people found post-SARS was that people had better family relationships, they often adopted healthier lifestyles, they had better mental health awareness, and yes, they often reported feeling happier and more effective in their general lives. So post-SARS, there was a benefit for many people, and we may well find that with COVID-19 as well. So this stealing effect and exposure to stressors builds resilience. One thing I can absolutely say with authority is that you don't get resilient from easy things. You get resilient from tough things. This is just an absolute truism. So I sometimes think of schooling, for instance, where people are spared losing, let's say. Actually, every child gets a prize. That actually worries me quite a bit, because that's fine until the child leaves school and applies for a job. Then they don't get the job. Do they get a prize? Well, no, they get nothing. They get rejection. And I just wonder whether it would be better for the school system to equip people by steeling them to these kinds of things in a safe environment, rather than creating a perception that the world is a dispositionally kind place. And we're certainly finding out now that it's not a dispositionally kind place. It's a place which suits the people who are resilient. We also see that there are many schools adopting a resilience perspective right now, which is very much targeted on increasing people's, how thick-skinned they are in being able to cope with things. So that's a really interesting change in education. So post-traumatic growth, there's also a thing called post-traumatic resilience, where people find that they're better at adapting to things. They have a psychological immunity to psychological injury or illness by virtue of having triumphed over these tough times. And so that can be associated with personality characteristics such as extroversion, self-esteem, assertiveness, hardiness, and an internal locus of control. Now, I'm going to talk a bit more about internal locus of control in just a moment, but this idea of ego resilience is where I am able to cope. I'm flexible, I'm assertive enough to deal with things, I've got a sense of humour, and affect regulation is all about I can manage my emotions. Emotions don't dominate me. So warning signs. How can you tell if things are going wrong for you? So here's some tips from Heads Up, which is a mental health organisation. Are you stressed? And I'll just give you a chance to read through these things. And if you're ticking a couple of the boxes here, it may well be that it's worthwhile exploring some of the solutions that we mentioned later in this presentation, or perhaps making contact, as I mentioned earlier, with EAP or with organisations like, for instance, Beyond Blue, who are equipped to help you with this kind of thing. Are your colleagues stressed? Do they seem more anxious than normal? Are they losing their temper more quickly? Are they noisier when you speak to them? Are they quieter than usual? Have they lost their sense of humour? Are they less confident than usual? And if you look at this, this really depicts the window of tolerance, doesn't it? So if people are losing their temper more quickly or more anxious, that's the fight and flight response. Whereas if they're avoiding you, it may well be that that's the hypoarousal effect of where people are kind of withdrawing into themselves. So this is all about people going outside their windows of tolerance. And when I ran the live version of this, it was amazing how much people were prepared to confess that they were personally stressed, and also that they were observing these characteristics in their colleagues where they are more stressed than normal. Just a quick comment on personality. If your workplace is the kind of workplace that attracts extroverts, then their tendency to respond to these challenges is to be more noisy, more active. If, on the other hand, people are introverts, so let's say IT people, accounting people, not all IT and accounting people are introverts, but yes, the majority tend to be, what you'll find is that they will tend to be more likely to withdraw within themselves. So personality will determine how people respond in terms of fight, flight, or freeze. Now, how to explore this? Well, of course, here in Australia, there's a campaign called Are You OK? And that's a great thing to do. Ask people, are they OK? But sometimes it's difficult for a person to say whether they're OK. And so we recommend a technique called feed forward rather than feedback. Are you OK is where you're asking them for feedback. Feed forward is where you put things in the future. And so alternatives to feedback are where you ask, is there anything I can do to help this work as well as possible? That's future-based. Let's talk about anything which is getting in the way at the moment so I can help you get on top of it, future-based. Do you have any suggestions about how to make these arrangements as successful as possible? Now, the reason I say these techniques is that if people tend to fob you off with, yeah, I'm fine, when you ask them the are you okay question, these are more exploratory questions or more exploratory techniques to cause people to come up with suggested solutions. And they tend to work because, being future focused, they turn on the parts of the brain which are much more likely to collaborate and much more likely to be creative. We know that if you turn on the new brain, people will be more solution focused. But finally, once more, do decide when you need help. These issues can become clinical, and that's where employee assistance programs can be really useful. So what can we do about all of this? One of the key things is focus. Everyone has the choice of focus, and the secret of life is what you focus on. That is to say that what we choose to focus on can have a massive impact on our levels of well-being. So we can focus on being optimistic and positive rather than pessimistic and negative. And the diary research that I'm mentioning here is that several studies have been undertaken in psychology where people were asked to keep diaries. One group was asked to keep a blessings diary, the good things that happened to them in the course of the day, and the other was asked to keep a challenges diary, the bad things that happened to them in the course of the day. Their levels of well-being were measured before, during, and after this process. And what was discovered is that the people who completed the optimism and gratitude diaries tended to have much higher levels of well-being longitudinally than the people who completed the challenges diary. So, talk positively, talk optimistically. I know people think that that's a little gormless, but the evidence is that this, by virtue of a thing called the human mirror cells say that if we hear positive stuff, we are likely to feel positive. They also mean if you hear negative stuff and pessimistic stuff, you're likely to become more negative, and that can affect your physical and mental health. So we know that negatives are more powerful than positives. So surrounding people with positivity and optimism is a good thing to do. By optimism, I don't mean so don't worry, be happy. It's really a self-efficacy approach. And the idea of self-efficacy is where people say, hey, I can cope. That's self-efficacy. Whatever happens, I can cope. At the group level, we will cope. We won't be knocked over by this. We will get through this together. We will stick together and we will get a really good outcome here. That's self-efficacy. People who say, well, look, everything's fine, don't worry, but that has no authenticity for people and they tend to ignore it. A focus on solutions rather than emotions. There was a time when it would have been heresy for a psychologist to say this. A focus on solutions is where if something goes wrong, we all sit down and say, okay, what are we going to do about it? A focus on emotions is to say when something goes wrong, hey, how do you feel? The problem is when people vent those negative feelings, they bring their own emotions down and they also bring the emotions of colleagues down. So I'm going to suggest that venting is in public is a bad thing for the individual. It exercises their amygdala and makes them more capable of anger, fear and depression. But it also brings down the emotions, the well-being of the people around them. So that's bad. To have a stronger amygdala is bad, and to bring down the emotions of colleagues is bad. The alternative is to redirect rather than to focus on emotions. Focus on the future, and by that we don't mean necessarily 2 years in the future. A really useful activity is if you have meetings to say, okay, well, what are we looking forward to this week? Get people to talk about what they're looking forward to in their private lives. You'll find if you do these kinds of activities that you get a positive emotional contagious effect. And a focus on what you can control and consciously directing focus away from what you can't control. You can't control how many cases are going to be reported in COVID-19. Yes, you may have a minor role to play by virtue of how you manage your personal life and the degree to which you self-isolate and those sorts of things. But really, it's something you can't control. You also can't control the economic fallout. What you can control is what you do every day to do a good job, what you do every day to maintain the relationships that you have. That's a focus on what you can control and a focus away from what you can't control. So this is about locus of control. This is a person with an internal locus of control. What that means is that this person believes that she has agency in her life. She believes that she can affect how her life is going to turn out. This is a person with an external locus of control. She doesn't believe that her life can be affected by decisions that she takes. And if you measure the mental health of people with internal and external locus of control, I don't have to tell you this, but clearly people with internal locuses of control, or loci of control, if you want the correct Latin, people with internal loci of control are certainly better from a psychological well-being point of view than people with an external locus of control. So the techniques that we talk about in positive psychology are often techniques which are geared to taking an external locus of control and making it an internal locus of control. So here's some self-management tips. One of the most powerful things that you can do is exercise. Exercise is incredibly good for you physically and mentally. People who are depressed, who take up resistance training, even 15 minutes 3 times a week, can get very significant improvements in mood. Seek to connect yourself with people, with activities that you love to do. Consciously avoid isolating yourself. Now, we know that the current circumstances are of their nature isolating for some people in Australia and New Zealand, well, in fact, all over the world. But the people who get through this best are people who will consciously reach out to other people, phone them, have Zoom meetings with them, contact them in other ways. Make sure that you're part of activity groups associated with doing things that you like. Make sure that you're lively in respect of undertaking things that you feel passionate about. If you do that, you will cause yourself to be more engaged in your life. Look after yourself. Eat healthy, non-refined foods. Just a quick pitch for non-refined foods. High glycemic, highly refined foods tend to increase inflammatory responses in the human body, and they're also not good for our mood. They tend to make us more angry. There's good, strong research evidence for that. And whereas if you eat whole foods, non-refined foods, that does tend to cause people to be more balanced and stable from a psychological point of view. And one of the things that we do know from this Okaraki article, vitamin D and omega-3 fatty acids, which come in the form of fish oil or eating freshwater and saltwater fish, and if you happen to be a vegetarian, flaxseed oils, those omega-3 fatty acids can be extremely powerful for helping people to improve their moods. So it's a good time to avoid drugs and alcohol and look after yourself. Make sure that you're exercising, make sure that you're taking care of eating healthy, sleeping as much as you can, making sure that you're really being kind to yourself. Now, I just want to talk a bit about mindfulness. Many of you, of course, have heard of mindfulness, but mindfulness is really about practicing focus management. I mentioned that focus is one of the most powerful things that you can concentrate on, well, ironically, focus on, if you're seeking to maximize your capacity to deal with stress. And focus management is about becoming conscious of your focus, consciously focusing on something helpful and practicing this. So firstly, you have to become conscious of your focus. When a challenge faces you, what are you focusing on? Are you focusing on what's wrong? Are you catastrophizing, focusing on the negative? Are you focusing on the future? Are you focusing on your emotions? All of those things may not be helpful. Focusing on what you want to achieve out of the situation, focusing on the best possible outcome and seeking how to get there, that can be valuable to you. So becoming conscious of your focus, and that's what mindfulness teaches us, then focusing on something helpful and then practicing that can be really valuable. Another mindfulness technique is not jumping to conclusion. So she hates me becomes, well, let me think of some reasons she might have acted like that. Maybe she's stressed. That's a mindful way of responding to this kind of a situation. And mindfully responding to life situations. This is really bad becomes, well, what are my options and what am I going to do? That's a mindful way of responding to life situations. So here's a simple model of mindfulness, just to explain to people. I know that many people have heard of mindfulness, but let's say you have 100 potential units of mental energy to use in a particular situation. We often find that when we undertake certain tasks, we don't use 100 units of mental energy. We may use 70, let's say. I haven't measured this, but let's say that's 70. Because let's say 30 gets taken over by what mindfulness practitioners often call a narrative. And what do I mean by a narrative? A narrative is a story that we tell ourselves about what is going on. And the narrative could be something like, hey, I'm really bad at this. Hey, this is really depressing. It may be something along the lines of, well, this is never going to end up well. This is a very threatening situation. Does that narrative help you to achieve what you want to achieve? And the answer is almost certainly no. The alternative is to focus on the here and now. And so focusing on the here and now would be things like being conscious of the best way of making the presentation. They'd be things like being conscious of the best way of pacing your presentation. They'd be things like being conscious of making sure that you look at the non-verbals of the people that you're dealing with and ensuring that you're relating to them effectively, that you're engaging with them. That's the best way to make a presentation. And if your energy is being sapped by the narrative, that's going to cause you to make a worse presentation. Now, the way to respond to this, historically, people said, well, you need to suppress the narrative. In other words, you need to try to reduce the degree to which these messages are coming through to you, these messages of negativity. And the only problem with that is that it doesn't work so well. The human brain fights suppression. It does not like to be suppressed. Whatever function is giving rise to this will actually strengthen if you seek to suppress it. So the alternative is not to fight the narrative. The alternative is to practice focusing on the here and now. And if you focus on the here and now, in other words, you practice being immersed in the moment, then what that will tend to do is it will increase the here and now, and therefore you in effect atrophy is the neurological term. You make the narrative weaker by virtue of strengthening this. So you kind of subtly reduce the strength of the narrative. And this is the technique called mindfulness. Now, one of the great founders of mindfulness techniques in the Western world was a gentleman by the name of John Kabat-Zinn, and still is. Kabat-Zinn was a medical researcher focusing on chronic pain. And he demonstrated that by teaching people mindfulness techniques, that would actually reduce their chronic pain. Just think of that. Maybe I've been on painkillers for years and I practice mindfulness, which in most cases is a form of meditation, and all of a sudden my levels of pain are reducing. Why? Because good practice, like bad practice, actually rewires your brain. So mindfulness activities can be things like mindfully eating, things where you're going to focus on what you're eating, you're going to sit down by yourself, you're going to experience every experience there is in your food, the sense of smell, the taste, the texture, and of course, like any of these activities, narrative will come, and you don't fight the narrative, you notice it, but you let it go. And people often use analogies like it's a cloud, just let it drift off into the sky, it's traffic, let it go off down the road, whatever. But in short, it's about focusing on the here and now. Now, mindful meditation is something that's used by a lot of people. As I mentioned earlier, there are a bunch of apps like Calm and Headspace that are really good at this. But in short, the estimates are that probably about 98% of the population benefits from mindfulness. It's a good thing to do. So if you are stressed, it's worthwhile considering that. So we get to the point about how leaders can contribute. It may actually be worthwhile measuring this. Stress is measurable and it's useful. In fact, it can be measured only with 4 or 5 questions. It can be useful to find out how stressed your employees are, and if so, by what? So this is a measure that we often use when we're measuring well-being of organisations. Good stress, so these are the challenges that people are facing, and bad stress, which are the hindrances. And so if you look at this, you'll see that this group of 44 staff had a high level of bad stress and a relatively low level of good stress. So that's not good, and what you find is that that group was relatively stressed overall. So this really raises the question about where this well-being tends to come from. And here's a really important point. If you are a team leader of, let's say, 5 people, the team of 5 people will get 80% of their well-being from that small team, even if they're in an organisation of thousands of people. So if you are in a good team in a bad organisation, you're in heaven. If you're in a bad team in a good organisation, you're in hell. Why? Because my job, my team, and my leader are proximal to me. That means close. Whereas the organisation is sort of a concept in many ways. It's distal from me. And so that's why it affects only 20% of my well-being. The reason I make this point so emphatically is that many organisations try to deal with these kinds of things at the corporate level. So if you're a 1,000 person organisation, I can tell you you're going to have between 50 and 70 teams, because when we've looked at organisations of that size, they've almost always had 50 to 70 teams in them. And those 50 to 70 teams, if you want high levels of well-being, it has to be dealt with at the local level. So let's talk about some leadership techniques which are really helpful in these challenging times. Firstly, lead for focus. One of the things that can be really useful is give people something to look forward to. Focus on a destination. I think one of the challenges of COVID-19 is that it just seems to drift along. Things just continue. And what you really need to do is it would be incredibly valuable to get your people together and to agree where we want to be in 6 months' time. You know, what's the optimum version of us as a team in 6 months' time? And then let's make a plan to get there. Do this by virtue of the technique of facilitative leadership, where you don't come to the group with a solution, you come to the group with a process to cause them to come up with a solution. So it's a very highly empowering approach. A focus on what we can control, ignoring what we can't. By the way, there's no need to make this stuff secret. Tell people, hey, we're doing this because I believe it's going to improve our well-being. I want us to talk about positive, future-focused things, solutions. I want us to not dwell too much on things that we can't control, like the economy. I don't want us to spend a great deal of time focusing on things like the disease. I mean, yes, let's do everything we can to make sure that this is a safe, clean, effective workplace and not COVID risky. Of course we're going to do that. We can control that. But let's not worry about things like case numbers, which are beyond our control. Focus on the positive. Let's talk about the good things we've achieved. That can be an absolute blessing in tough times. All right, yeah, clearly there are tough things going on, but let's talk about the good things we've achieved. A focus on solutions rather than emotions. Let's get together and come up with our best way of doing this. That can be a really positive thing. And a focus on self-efficacy. I know we can do this. I know we can cope. Let me tell you a little bit about tough times and easy times in organisations. People think that tough times cause lower levels of well-being in organisations. I refute that utterly. Sometimes tough times cause people to pull together and they will actually improve the levels of well-being of employees. In general, when tough times cause lower levels of well-being, it's because of the fact that the behaviours of staff and leaders get worse. Tough times often cause us to behave worse. That's what affects well-being, not the tough times themselves. Now, I want to talk a little bit about control and stress. And so we know Van der Diff and Mays are just two of the researchers that were able to demonstrate this relationship between stress and control. And it's like this. If you are low in stress, so you're not a very stressed situation, and you're low in control, in other words, you don't have much say over what's going on, let's call that a sleepy kind of a situation. But here's the one that you really have to look out for. If you have high levels of stress and low levels of control, then you run the risk of a thing called burnout. Burnout is not imaginary. Burnout is a genuine psychological phenomenon. It's actually a kind of a PTSD sort of a response. So people who are burnt out are people who've experienced chronic stress and develop PTSD symptoms quite often, like withdrawal, like nightmares, like avoidance, those kinds of things. So if you are in a situation where people are highly stressed, then what you really need to do is you need to make sure that they have satisfactory levels of control. If people are low in stress and high in control, well, that's pretty comfortable. But people's peak experiences are often when they're high in stress and in high in control. So that might be a situation where you're undertaking a very important challenge, like a project. You may be time limited, but you know what? You have a lot of say in what's going on. So what this means, a really important point, is that empowerment is an extremely valuable technique for ensuring that people have high levels of well-being in stressful times. And if you're going to run an organisation purely top-down in stressful times, beware of the fact that you may well be causing your staff to be more susceptible to burnout. Top-down does not work very well in tough times. Now, of course, levels of leader support are also crucial. So where leaders are helpful, kind, friendly, caring in terms of trying to cause people to increase their levels of skills, all of those things matter enormously. So let's talk about leadership options. This is, of course, a simplification. It's not really 3 leadership options. There are an infinity of leadership options. The first I'm going to talk about is top-down leadership, where I am acting as a boss. You need to be able to do that to be an effective leader. You need to be able to tell people what to do. Of course, that's a crucial skill. When somebody starts on their first day in the job, it doesn't make sense to say, well, what do you want to do? It makes sense to say, here's your desk, here's your induction program, we've got a Zoom meeting to catch up at 2 o'clock today, here's how your first week's going to look. I mean, that's classic top-down leadership, and you need to be able to do that. You also need to be able to consult people, where you ask them their opinions about things, but then you go back and you think about it and you decide. But if you want high levels of well-being and you want high levels of perceived control from your staff, then facilitative leadership is where you would get the group together. This dotted line means that they are all together. It could be physically, but it also could be in a Zoom meeting or a Teams meeting or something like that. And what you'll do is you'll run small group activities where you ask the group to come up with answers to certain questions. Like, how are we going to cope with the situation that we're in right now? What's the best way of managing these remote working circumstances? What's the best way of ensuring that we have high levels of customer satisfaction in these challenging times? And then a truly facilitative leader does what the group says. So there are times when a leader has to decide, yeah, I'm the boss, times when the leader has to decide, well, I'm going to ask my colleagues what they think and then make my own mind up, and times when a leader should facilitate solutions. Just remember the link between control and stress, and understand that if you are providing people with a sense of facilitative leadership where they have authority to decide what happens, they are much more likely to be high in well-being and less stressed. So just to draw some conclusions for all of this, well, firstly, it's a good idea to recruit resilient staff. That's really helpful. Resilience tends to persist through the course of life, and that's a good thing. But of course, you have the staff that you have. One of the things that we know from all of the perspectives on well-being, your own well-being is crucial to the well-being of people around you. Basic healthy lifestyle and the power of focus. Start practicing focus. If you do mindfulness activities, what that will do is, of its very nature, it will cause you to become more aware of your own focus, but it will also give you the authority and the confidence to redirect your focus to the things that are going to help. Develop the skills to assess the well-being of your colleagues, and we've given you some questions that you might like to consider in working your way through whether the colleagues are coping or not. Lead for focus. In other words, encourage your staff. Be open with them. We are focusing on things that are going to help us rather than harm us. Lead for support. Be supportive to people. That's pretty obvious. Lead for empowerment. So I would be suggesting that one of the things that you might like to consider is making sure that you are doing what you can to cause staff to be empowered in making certain decisions, and work hard on choosing which is best to be done in that form. You actually can't do a great deal about life stress, but you can make an enormous impact on work-related stress. And one of the things that we know is that people spend so much time at work that if their work life is high well-being, that will flow over to their life well-being, their broader well-being. And finally, know when to send for the experts. Don't saddle yourself with the burden of trying to cover the entire authority or responsibility for your staff's well-being, especially if it's outside of work. Do the things that we've mentioned up above. Create a high well-being workplace, and you will be doing what you can to contribute to the well-being of your staff beyond work at the same time. I hope some of these ideas are useful to you. Thank you very much for listening today, and may the rest of your day be extremely high well-being.